Money makes the world go round. But unfortunately, some people have made a career out of defrauding others of their hard-earned cash. In this video, let's take a look at the biggest financial scams in history, from the Ponzi scheme to corporate fraud. Get ready to be shocked and appalled as we take a deep dive into the world of financial deception. Let's start with the man who gave us the term Ponzi scheme. In the early 20th century, Charles Ponzi convinced investors to invest in a scheme where he proposed them high returns by purchasing and selling international postal reply coupons. Ponzi claimed that he could exploit differences in the cost of these coupons in different countries and generate profits for investors. However, Ponzi's scheme was a fraud from the get-go. Rather than investing in the postal reply coupons, he actually used new investors' money to pay off the earlier investors, creating the illusion of returns and thus perpetuating the fraud. Ponzi also took a significant cut of the money for himself, amassing a fortune and living lavishly. The Ponzi scheme eventually collapsed in 1920, when a newspaper investigation revealed that Charles Ponzi had not actually purchased any postal reply coupons and that the scheme was a fraud. Ponzi was arrested and eventually pleaded guilty to several charges, including mail fraud. The Ponzi scheme became notorious for its simplicity and effectiveness in defrauding investors. It also gave rise to a new form of financial fraud in which early investors are actually paid and made whole from new investors, rather than generating the return from legitimate business activities. In the aftermath of the Ponzi scheme, regulators and lawmakers enacted a series of reforms to prevent such frauds from happening again. The Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 established the regulatory framework for securities markets and required companies to disclose financial information to investors. This was one of the most infamous financial scams in history and gave rise to the popular concept of the Ponzi scheme. It exposed the need for greater regulatory framework and oversight and led to significant reforms in security regulation. But one man still got around that in recent history. Bernie Madoff is perhaps the most infamous financial fraudster of all time. His Ponzi scheme, which he ran for over 2 decades, defrauded investors of over $65 billion. Bernie Madoff was a respected financier and former chairman of the Nasdaq Stock Exchange. He ran an investment advisory firm called Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities, LLC, which he started in the 1960s. For decades, Madoff's firm was considered one of the most successful and trusted on Wall Street, with clients including wealthy individuals, hedge funds, and institutional investors. However, it was later revealed that Madoff's success was built on a massive Ponzi scheme that lasted for decades. Madoff would use the funds of new investors to pay off returns to older investors, instead of investing the money as promised. Sound familiar? This allowed him to keep the scam going for many years and amass a fortune estimated at over $65 billion. The fraud began to unravel in 2008 during the global financial crisis, when many investors tried to withdraw their money and Madoff was unable to meet their demands. He was eventually arrested and sentenced to 150 years in prison for securities fraud, money laundering, and perjury. The Madoff scandal had far-reaching consequences, with thousands of investors losing their life savings and some charities being completely wiped out. The scandal also highlighted the failure of regulators in the financial industry as a whole, who had failed to detect the fraud despite numerous red flags and warnings, especially after the regulations set in place by the original Ponzi scheme. In the aftermath, many changes were ultimately made to regulatory framework, like before. For example, the SEC created a new division focused on fraud detection and compliance, and Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, which did strengthen financial regulation and oversight. Now that we've talked about Ponzi schemes, let's talk about one of the most infamous business collapses in history: Enron. Enron was a major energy company based in the United States that was once considered one of the most innovative and successful companies in the world. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Enron's stock price soared as the company expanded into new markets and developed new products and services. However, Behind the scenes, Enron's executives were engaged in massive accounting fraud that involved hiding losses and inflating profits through a series of complex financial maneuvers. The company created special purpose entities, or SPEs, that were used to move debt and losses off of Enron's books, while also inflating the value of assets and profits. When the fraud was finally uncovered in 2001, Enron's stock price plummeted, and the company was forced to file for bankruptcy. Thousands of employees lost their jobs, and investors lost billions of dollars. The Enron scandal was a watershed moment in the history of corporate fraud and served as a wake-up call for investors and regulators. It exposed the dangers of corporate greed and the importance of transparency and accountability in financial reporting. The scandal led to the passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which was designed to strengthen financial reporting and improve corporate accountability. The act requires companies to establish internal controls over financial reporting and to certify the accuracy of their financial statements. It also increased penalties for corporate fraud and established new oversight mechanisms to hold executives accountable for financial misconduct. The Enron scandal also had a profound impact on the energy industry, leading to increased scrutiny and regulation of energy trading and the creation of a new oversight body such as the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. But let's talk about something that happened rather recently: FTX. FTX was founded in 2019 by now infamous Sam Bankman-Fried, or SBF, and Gary Wang. It quickly gained reputation for one of the most innovative and transparent cryptocurrency exchanges in the world, with a focus on creating new financial instruments for traders. However, in late 2022, reports began to surface of irregularities at the exchange. It was alleged that FTX had been engaging in fraudulent practices, including insider trading, market manipulation, and misappropriation of funds. The allegations were initially dismissed by FTX's management, including SBF, who claimed that they were baseless and unfounded. But as more evidence began to emerge and people began to withdraw their money, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. Authorities launched an investigation into FTX's activities. It was discovered that the exchange had been using customer funds to cover its own losses, especially in its supposedly separate trading arm, Alameda Research. As the investigation progressed, FTX's reputation began to plummet. Traders tried en masse to withdraw their funds, creating a bank run of sorts, and the exchange was soon facing a liquidity crisis. In November 2022, FTX announced that it was filing for bankruptcy, and the exchange had lost millions of dollars in customer funds, and it was clear that there was no way back from the brink. The collapse of FTX marks one of the biggest pivotal moments in the latest downturn of cryptocurrency markets, and is a stark reminder of the risks involved in the world of digital assets. Despite its reputation for being decentralized and secure, the cryptocurrency market is still widely vulnerable to fraud and manipulation, even by the market's biggest players. But now, let's talk about Worldcom. Worldcom was a telecommunications company based in the United States that was once one of the largest in the world. In the early 2000s, the company's CEO, Bernard Ebbers, was under intense pressure to meet Wall Street's expectations for the company's financial performance. In an effort to boost the company's stock price and maintain its position as a leading telecommunications provider, Ebbers and other top executives engaged in accounting fraud. The fraud involved inflating the company's earnings through a series of complex accounting maneuvers. Sound familiar? For example, the company classified expenses as capital expenditures, which allowed them to be treated as investments, rather than costs that would impact the company's earnings. Essentially, they would buy lunch and say this was an investment for the future. This made the company appear way more profitable than it actually was. When the fraud was eventually uncovered in 2002, WorldCom's stock price plummeted, and the company was forced to file for bankruptcy. The scandal was one of the largest in U.S. history and resulted in the loss of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars to investors. Awfully familiar to Enron. The WorldCom scandal was a wake-up call for investors, regulators, and the business community as a whole, and again, highlighted the importance of ethical behavior and corporate governance. The WorldCom collapse, in addition to the very similar Enron collapse, ultimately led to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which we talked about before, and additional oversight mechanisms to keep these collapses from happening in the future. Next, let's talk about Bre-X minerals. Bre-X Minerals was a Canadian mining company that claimed to have discovered one of the largest gold deposits in history in Busang, Indonesia, in 1993. The company's stock price soared as investors believed that the discovery would make them wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. However, it soon became apparent that the claims made by the company were just too good to be true. Independent geologists hired to verify the gold deposits found no evidence of significant amounts of gold or any other valuable minerals at the Busang site. The company executives were accused of falsifying their reports and bribing officials in Indonesia to cover up their deception. When the truth was finally revealed, the company's stock price plummeted and many investors lost everything. The scandal rocked the mining industry and left many investors wary of investing in resource-based companies. The Bre-X Minerals scandal serves as a cautionary tale for the importance of thorough due diligence for companies and making sure they're not just straight up lying about their business efforts. In addition to the financial losses suffered by investors, the Bre-X scandal also had a devastating impact on the local community of Indonesia. Many workers who invested their time and labor in the Busang site lost their jobs and livelihoods as a result of the scandal. Finally, let's talk about the South Sea bubble. In the early 1700s, the British government was facing a large debt that it needed to pay off. The South Sea Company saw an opportunity and proposed a plan to the government. In exchange for taking over the government's debt, the company would be granted a monopoly on trade with South America. The company's stock price soared as investors believed that the company would make huge profits from trade with the Southern American continent. The company even paid out a dividend to shareholders, further fueling enthusiasm for the stock. However, the reality was far different from what investors had been led to believe. The South Sea Company had very little trade with South America, and its operations were nowhere near as profitable as investors had been told. The company's executives were engaging in fraudulent accounting practices, again, inflating the company's profits and hiding its losses. When that truth was finally revealed, the stock price again collapsed, and thousands of investors lost their life savings. It led to a major crisis of confidence in the stock market at the time, and investors altogether started shying away from investing in stocks. The South Sea bubble is often cited as the first major financial bubble in history. A bubble occurs when investors become overly enthusiastic about a particular asset, driving up its price far beyond its true value, and when the bubble bursts, the asset price collapses, and investors who bought in at the peak of the bubble can lose everything. The South Sea bubble itself serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of blindly following the crowd and investing without understanding what's really happening under the scenes. So these are some of the biggest financial scams in history, and one thing is for sure, the scams always come to light when the market downturns. So now that the market in 2023 and 2024 is entering this bear market and on a downturn, there's for sure going to be many more scams that have persisted over the last decade that now come to light. So keep your eyes peeled.